So hello and welcome to another Valorant meta-analysis. Today we are talking about agents that need to be buffed. Yesterday we talked about the agents that need to be nerfed, so go and check that out if you haven't seen it. And today we'll talk about the ones that need to be buffed. Now, obviously there's a sweet spot. This is the agent pick rates for the Valorant Champions Tournament. Obviously today we'll be looking at the lower numbers because we're talking about agents that need to be buffed. Chamber will not be included in this video, and neither will Yoru actually. Because Yoru we know is getting reworked, so, I'm not going to waste my breath talking about, oh, they could change Yoru like this, when we know that Yoru is going to get changed in a pretty meaningful, substantial way, not just a buff, but an actual rework. So I'm not going to talk about Yoru or Chamber in this video, and yeah, with that said, let's dive in. But just before we do, I will also mention that there are, of course, two things that, the Riot dev team has to consider when looking at just, play rates in general, and that is, of course, ranked play rate and pro play rate varies, somewhat wildly, I would think, for certain agents. For instance, Astra, I assume, has a much higher pro pick rate than she does in ranked. Sage and Reyna, I would guess, have a much higher ranked pick rate than they do at the pro level. And obviously, it's about finding a balance for both that they are happy with. And, for instance, I would think it might be quite risky to say buff Reyna, because then you might see literally Reyna in every single game without fail, and you're already probably not, I don't have the numbers, but I would bet that Reyna is probably up there with Jett in terms of the most picked agents, and so you have to think about that and how you actually balance the game on both levels. So for that reason, even though they don't have the highest pick rate at the pro scene, I won't be including Sage or Reyna in this discussion. But with that said, we'll move into the agents that we will be talking about. And the first one I want to tackle, and we'll go from top to bottom here, is Cypher. So let's start with Cypher, and here are Cypher's abilities. As you all know, he has the Trapwire, the Cypher Cage, the Spy Cam, and the Neural Theft. And Cypher is, as we just saw, the highest pick rate of the agents we will be talking about today. So, as we go further down the list, we'll be looking at sort of more and more significant buffs. As we're just talking here, I think, Cypher doesn't need some crazy change, but I do think, there are some things we could change. And I think for me, the big one would be his ultimate. And I know that I'm not alone in this, that Cypher's ultimate, look, sometimes is very good. Obviously, everyone's ultimate is meant to be somewhat useful. But Cypher's also has, sort of the ability to not be that useful a lot of the time. It requires, you having a dead body that is recently there. So normally that will include Cypher getting a kill straight away to get his ult, which, can be a bit frustrating, I think. Then also, the range on the hat, the bold Cypher, you could say. I've heard, people say that maybe making the range longer for it would be better. And obviously that it only gives you one ping that the opponents get to sort of set up. They get a bit of time before that ping goes off. And so that, they can play with that information if they want to. All of those things, of course, can make the Cypher seem not as useful as perhaps others can be. And I do think that just a small change to the Neural Theft in some way would be quite helpful for Cypher, whether that just be, it pings twice instead of just once, or it goes off straight away, without the delay, or, as I was talking about, there's a longer range, or the amount of time that the death is allowed for Cypher to then ult onto is longer. All of those things, I think, could happen and would be a nice buff to Cypher without going crazy. I don't think that Cypher needs, too much different. He's still a decent agent on a lot of different maps, and so I don't think you need to go crazy with him, but I do think just slightly improving the ult in some way would be quite nice. Next up, with a 23% pick rate, we come to Breach, and I don't think, again, Breach needs too much to push him, into viability. But I do think, just a couple small changes here or there would be quite nice to Breach as a whole. And so how can we change Breach? Well, to me, one of the main things when playing Breach, one of the main annoyances, and I'm sure if you've played Breach at all, you will definitely feel this too, is that dying when someone is stunned is the most annoying thing in the game ever. And so this is what I would do. I would simply make, when an opponent is stunned, it does more to them than it currently does. It throws off their bullets more than it does currently. It makes their inaccuracy higher. Things like that, maybe they shoot even slower. All of those things. If you are stunned, it makes a bigger deal. It's a bigger impact on you. And I think that obviously this would affect more than just Breach. Obviously, I think Cypher, Astra, Skye all have ways of stunning an opponent. There might be more, but I can't think off the top of my head if there is. But obviously Breach would be the main one, of course, because he kind of is the stun agent. And so I think that that would be a big help to Breach overall. And I don't think the difference would be so crazy for those other agents that, it wouldn't be worth doing. I think it would just, reward playing well. And I think that that's what you should always be looking at as a dev. Like, if you want to achieve the dream with this agent, the problem for Breach is even if you do achieve that dream, you rolling Thunder 4 of them, you can still die quite easily a lot of the time. It doesn't even take that much a lot of the time. And so that feels really, really bad that even when you've played well, you're getting punished for it even though you've done everything right. That shouldn't often be the case. And so I think, making that a rarer occurrence would be quite nice for Breach. Next up, we have Raze, and Raze had a 20% pick rate, but Raze is in a bit of an interesting, unique situation, I would think, because Raze actually, I don't think, is that bad. I feel like Raze's problem is that she is trying to compete against Jett, who is obviously broken. So what that means is we might not actually need to buff Raze herself, and that a significant nerf to Jett might instead be enough to therefore make Raze, and her pick rate become high enough to where it's okay. And I do think that that might be the case. Now, if you disagreed, I think, again, you're looking at very minimal, kind of buffs to Raze. It would be small, I think, damage increases to things like the Showstopper, maybe the grenade, very small amounts of damage increase to those just to make them a tiny bit better. I think that that honestly would all you'd be looking at for Raze, because I think what's more important for Raze is that Jett gets nerfed in a significant way, because then I feel like on maps like Bind, on maps like Split, maybe even Fracture as well, that Raze would then just become a somewhat, regular pick on those maps, and those maps she would flourish on, and Jett could have some of the other maps, and some of the other duelists could potentially come in to some of the other maps as well. But I think that Raze would be in a good place as long as Jett, gets somewhat of a significant nerf. Next up, with an 18% pick rate, was KO, and KO obviously did get buffed somewhat recently, and we did see more pick rate from him in the Champions Tournament than perhaps I was expecting, but we might want to see even more from KO. And how do we do this? Well, they reduced the times to flash, right? They kind of changed the timing on the flash to make it a bit better for KO. I still think the overhanded flash, for whatever reason, feels very clunky still. It still feels very slow. And, you very rarely see someone use the overhand flash in a way that I'm like, oh, wow, that was pretty impressive. It's not like, I've seen people, play as Sky, particularly at the pro level, and help the rest of their team with a flash from a long distance. With KO, it feels very rare, and it feels like, there is just that less control over what's going on as a whole, and I feel like, again, something could be changed there. If not, obviously, there are plenty of other good ways of buffing KO. Things like, just the 0 point having a bigger radius, things like that. The ult having a bigger radius, things like that would always be nice, and could always be used. And so, again, I don't think KO needs a massive buff, but I think, again, just small improvements, just to kind of remind people, hey, maybe you want to try out the new KO with this small improvement. I think that those kind of things could be quite nice again. Okay, now I'm coming back to the stats because we need to, just remind ourselves that so far, I've gone down to KO, but you can see that there is a large gap between, the agents that I've talked about so far and the rest. Now, Yoru isn't on this, and obviously Chamber wasn't a part of it. Yoru, of course, was 0% as well, but he's getting reworked. So then we come to these three agents, Brimstone, Omen, and Phoenix, which saw extremely low play rates. And so we need to then talk about, more significant buffs for these three, because I would put a big separating divider between KO and Brimstone in terms of power level. For the agents we talked about so far, we've talked about very small buffs and how that might go. For these, we're looking at, more significant changes. And so let's start with Brimstone. Now, Brimstone, when we look at his abilities, I know a lot of people have a problem with the Stim Beacon, and we'll come back to that. But let's take a look through his abilities. So you have the Stim Beacon, you have the Incendiary, which I actually think, everyone is fine with, thinks it's pretty good. It's a pretty good ability. You have obviously his Smokes, they're kind of needed, obviously. And you have the Orbital Strike, which is ultimate, which again, I think most people are happy with. I think for me, the change has to come either with the Stim Beacon or the smoke. And the first thing to me that Brimstone needs is a rechargeable smoke. I think that that is so important and is such a big problem for Brimstone as opposed to the other controllers that he doesn't have that ability. I understand that Brimstone has kind of the ability to, place 3 smokes at once, which others don't have the ability to do. And, he can very quickly do that. It's a very quick process with Brimstone of just going bap, 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 let's go, and go on to site. The problem is, of course, if you get repelled then at all, and this is why I think he hasn't seen picked in the pro level, is because if you get repelled, which by a good team you often will be, on that initial kind of entry point in, then Brimstone becomes useless because you use those smokes, and now all of a sudden, oh, I'm out of smokes. I've become a useless controller. Most of what I'm here for is now gone completely. And so that is a big problem. And I think obviously the way you fix that is give him a rechargeable smoke. I think that would just bring him in line with the other controllers as a point, and I think that would be a really significant change to start off with. The second one, obviously, is Stim Beacon, and how do we potentially change Stim Beacon? Now, I know that a lot of people have said a lot of different things about the Stim Beacon and what you could do. There's obviously the combat stim that is in Spike Rush, lets you run quicker and things like that, and people have said, oh, what if it let you, whoever's in it, they can run quicker for a bit. It becomes more like the stim in a Spike Rush game. And obviously we don't know what the devs have planned for future agents as well. So, we can't necessarily, it's not easy to just suggest a rework of an ability because we don't know what, the devs have planned for later on. And, that might dive into, what future agents are doing. Like we know that this newest agent that's coming out is to do with mobility and speed. It's very possible she has a similar ability to that, and so we can't therefore just give that to Brimstone because it's taking away from a next agent, right? So it's very difficult to think about how you want to rework abilities. So I'm not necessarily going to suggest a rework for the Stim Beacon, but if one could be found, or just a way of making the Stim Beacon more useful, whatever that might be, right? I think, having the reloads be quicker as well, similar to maybe a Reyna ult whilst you have the Stim Beacon, things like that, I think could be quite nice overall, and I think would be a help again. But I actually think that the biggest thing is the smokes. If Brimstone has good smokes, then that's what most of his character is doing anyway. Okay, next up we have Omen, and we can go to Omen's abilities, and obviously we have the Shrouded Step, the Paranoia, the Dark Cover, and the From the Shadows. And so we can talk about, okay, how do we buff Omen in this way? And again, we need a pretty significant buff to Omen to allow him to become, in line with the other controllers, particularly Astra, right? So Omen is kind of different to the other controllers, at least the ones we have so far, because Omen kind of fulfills that initiator duelist controller hybrid. Much like Viper is kind of the sentinel controller hybrid, Omen, I feel, is meant to be kind of the more duelist initiator controller hybrid character, obviously with his flash, with his Shrouded Step. He has that sort of mobility in a way. He has a flash, so he is more of a kind of, aggressive, you might say, controller as a whole. So with that said, how can we, push that and make that good so that he's different to the other controllers and, can fulfill on certain team comps? Well, it has to do, I think, mainly less with his actual smokes, unlike Brimstone, and more to do with his paranoia and maybe his ult and maybe the Shrouded Step as well. The first thing I think that you could do is obviously make the paranoia 250. That's obviously bringing it more in line with all of the other flashes in the game. So, Omen's flash is just like all the other flashes. And I also think, we had those suggested changes of it not hitting allies. I personally was on board with that because that to me makes a lot of sense. It makes it quite rewarding to play, and you get to fulfill that kind of initiator role. Now, they might think that, well, that's not quite fair because, Sky flashes can flash your teammates, Breach flashes can flash your teammates. So maybe that isn't fair. But I do think there is a way to buff paranoia as a whole. Whether it becomes wider or longer or whatever it might be, the vision becomes even less. All of those things, I think, I would just improve paranoia. Whatever way you want to improve it, I think is fine. But I do think it needs a buff in some way. And as I mentioned, bringing the price down as well would also be part of that. And then we also have Omen's ult. And I do think that his ult is probably the other part of it that I would change. I feel like Omen's ult is one of the least important in a game for the most part, and so I would probably make it 6 points. That's kind of the biggest buff I think that you're probably going to get to an ult at this point without completely reworking it. And, you know, again, we had those kind of mini leaks of, you know, if you're right next to a person, it, you know, causes them, you know, similar kind of things to what Paranoia does. I think that that's a pretty cool change overall, and I think that that would be quite cool and quite fitting for the character. And so what I would do is I would make the ult 6 points, and I would give it that kind of, you know, near sight effect if, you know, you are right next to someone. Those kind of things I think would be pretty cool. And I think that those two things combined would make Omen, you know, a worthwhile pick, especially for certain team comps that might want to go away from initiators and more to duelists or more to sentinels or whatever. You know, I think that that would give Omen a nice role to fulfill and make him quite a powerful agent. So last but not least is Phoenix and his whopping 0% pick rate in the tournament. So let's look at his abilities and see how he might fix them. So we have obviously his Blaze Wall, his Curveball, his Hot Hands, and his Run It Back. Now his ultimate Run It Back is still probably one of the best in the game, so we probably don't need to be touching that too much. It's really focusing on these three abilities and how we make them better. Now I know one thing that a lot of people have said is making Phoenix's flash faster, as in making it more of a duelist flash, a very fast, I'm swinging right now, you know, flash, swing around the corner, you're dead, you know, I'm using my flash as well, I'm being rewarded for doing that because I'm a duelist, and that's what we do. And I have no problem with that at all. I think that that is quite a good idea in general, and will help Phoenix quite a lot. But then also, I do think that there is possibility to change either the Hot Hands or the Blaze Wall. Now, the Flame Wall, again, there's plenty of things that you could do with it. You can make it longer. You could make it go through walls potentially as well, which would be a very interesting change. I'm not quite sure if that would fit in with the kind of whole design concept of Phoenix, because that would kind of turn Phoenix into almost a bit of a do-it-all kind of controller. You know, that would add a controller element to Phoenix as well, which, I mean, I guess it already does, but even more so, right? It would be kind of a controller for even teammates. Which, you know, might be quite useful on certain maps and instant situations. So it actually could be a pretty decent idea if you wanted to do that. And I think buffing either the wall or the Hot Hands is kind of necessary, whether that's, you know, the Hot Hands has a bigger size and, you know, does more damage or whatever it is. You know, I think all of those things really do matter and will matter for Phoenix. I do think that changing with the curveball, you know, that would give him 2 out of 4 very good abilities. And then I feel like if just one of these ends up being a bit better than it currently is, then you actually do start to get an agent that, you know, I could see teams picking, and I could see people being like, okay, this is actually pretty good. You know, particularly if the flashes are effective, that, you know, a team might go, yeah, no, this is actually quite good with the ult and with the flashes, and, you know, with either of the Hot Hands or Blaze being, you know, particularly quite good and not just used as a healing tool. I feel like that is kind of the problem, that these abilities are being used too much maybe as healing tools and not enough as, you know, as kind of aggressive tools to get kills or, you know, create good space with. I do think that might be a bit of a problem, but I do think it could be fixed pretty easily with just a simple buff to one or the other, and then you'd have an agent that actually you could probably play and not feel too bad about. And so those were just some of my buff suggestion ideas. I'd be interested to see what you think. You know, did I miss anything out? Do any agents need buffs in other ways at all? What would you do with certain agents? I'm sure, you know, if you are a main of some of these agents, then you probably know more about it than I do, because, you know, I don't play a lot of these agents too much. So I'm sure that you potentially might know more than I do about this. So I'd be interested to know what you would change about a certain agent. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.